I would like to greet our interlocutor for the evening, Dr. Ralph Snyderman, who will introduce us to Eva. Dr. Snyderman is Chancellor Emeritus, James B. Duke Professor of Medicine, and Director of the Center for Personalized Healthcare at Duke University. Dr. Snyderman also served as Duke's Chancellor for Health Affairs and Dean of the School of Medicine for 15 years, and was the founding CEO of Duke University Health System. We are honored to have you here with us tonight to facilitate this momentous occasion.
Thank you, Chabad. Thank you, Zalman, for allowing me to be here with you at this very special historic moment. This is, we've heard the word historic several times tonight. We are here to talk about and to try to understand at least a little bit more about the Holocaust. For me, a physician-scientist, over and above the horrors that you have seen, that many of us know about, we will discuss to a degree tonight, was the intention behind it, the diabolical intention behind it. We unfortunately are swamped with so many atrocities. Atrocities are all around us. But what was so different about this atrocity, in addition to the numbers? It was the intent of a presumed civilized, highly cultured civilization to solve the Jewish problem by eliminating the entire genetic pool of what is Jewish, with scientific intent to identify every inherited characteristic of what makes an individual a Jew and to eliminate it. Incredibly diabolic. Zalman made reference to Passover, which is coming up very, very soon. The major message of Passover, Zalman gave his concepts about it. And what I want to say very specifically, because I want to try to reach every one of you deep in your hearts and minds as to why you are here tonight. Why are you here tonight? You could have been in so many different places, but you chose to be here tonight. In Passover, what we have been saying for over 3,000 years is that everybody around that table should experience the exodus from slavery until freedom as though they had been there. It's less telling a story than experiencing a story, living a story. So this is my challenge to everybody in this magnificent audience. Take a deep breath or two. Get into your breath for a moment and appreciate why you're here. You're here because you have an opportunity to live, in a sense, vicariously through somebody who actually experienced the Holocaust, from before it happened, while it happened, after it happened, and then to achieve the enlightenment that this individual's life's mission, or one of her missions, was to tell that story. And our responsibility is to live that story as best we can, as though we were there, through the eyes and the history that we will hear from Eva Schloss. So, Mrs. Eva Schloss is the stepsister and childhood friend of Anne Frank. We'll talk about that a bit later. She is also the trustee of the Anne Frank Educational Trust, author of 3 books, and the subject of James Still's play, And Then They Came for Me, Remembering the World of Anne Frank. In many ways, Eva Schloss enables Anne Frank and her story to live today. So we really have 2 stories. We have Eva Schloss and the carrying on of the memory and the story of Anne Frank. Since 1985, Eva Schloss has devoted herself to Holocaust education and global peace. She recounted her wartime experiences in more than 1,000 speaking engagements. But tonight's going to be very, very special. And it's going to be so special because you're here. You're here. It's the only time that this will have happened. In 1999, she signed the Anne Frank Peace Declaration along with the United Nations Secretary Kofi Annan. Tonight, we will share together the story of the Holocaust through Eva Schloss's recollections. And please join me in welcoming Eva Schloss to do it. Well, it's so good to have you here. I had a chance to speak with Eva for about an hour, and I feel very, very Hamish with her, as though we're old friends already. I'm looking forward to hearing the story from you. So, to start, if we think of this as a voyage, starting in 1929 until now, you were born in 1929 in Vienna. Your father was a shoe manufacturer. You actually grew up in a reasonably good environment. Beautiful house to me, absolutely beautiful corner house. You had your mother, Fritzi, Mutti, your father, Eric, Pappy, and your brother Heinz. Could you give us a description of what was it like growing up in Vienna before Hitler had his major impact on the country, and then maybe what started happening?
It changed the whole life of many, many, many millions of people. Well, like you said, we were very lucky. We had a good home, a good family, wonderful parents, a great brother, wonderful grandparents as well, and a nice country with mountains and lakes. And I really took to it. I was very sporty with my father together. We did in the winter, we did mountain climbing. I was quite a brave little girl. In the winter we went skiing, not on a ski lift up and down, but we packed a backpack with our lunch, and we spent the morning climbing up a mountain with skins on our skis. I was only that little. And when we got to the top, we had our lunch, and then we came down. That was the whole excursion, not up and down on a ski lift. And, you know, I just loved everything, but unfortunately, when Hitler marched in without permission, without warning, life changed for not just for our family, but for all the Jewish people. And the Austrians changed overnight. They became more Nazis even as in Germany, and they stood with their swastika flags waving and their hand upraised, Heil Hitler. And from day one, Jewish people were pulled out of their homes and beaten up. But I remember very clearly my brother, who was 12 years old, he came home. He was badly, badly beaten. Blood was streaming from his nose, and he looked really terrible. And when my parents questioned him, he said, my own friends did that, and the teachers just watched and let it happen. This was the situation, from one day to the next.
Now, one of the points that you made to me when we were talking is that individuals in Vienna that were your friends, that were not Jewish, and they were your acquaintance and your friends. Once it became acceptable and maybe even expected to be anti-Semitic, they turned out to be Nazis.
Yes.
Could you just comment about that people that you knew, that you were friends with, what was it like to see them turn, and what did that teach you?
Well, it was, you know, we just couldn't believe it. A couple of days before, my parents had made excursions with them, at dinner with them, went to the theater, got a little bit drunk perhaps even, and the next days they didn't want to talk with us anymore, they ignored us, and you know, as if we had committed a terrible crime.
Yeah.
It was really a culture shock.
Now, your parents were very intelligent people, very much in control of themselves and their lives. I imagine before Hitler actually invaded Austria, it became obvious that very, very likely Jews needed to get out of there. Could you tell us a bit about what it was like and what your father did to be able to get you out of Austria? What were you telling me?
Well, my father, obviously, you know, they didn't discuss this with us children, of course. Parents didn't want to frighten us, so life seemed as if it was going to go on like normal. But in the meantime, my father, he was exporting to the Netherlands. There was a big shoe industry there, and obviously, I only heard that later, he exported, let's say, for 10,000 shilling and left 5,000 only in Holland, and only got the money back for half of his export. So he built up a little capital in Holland. So because, you know, this was a big, big problem, because once people, if they were lucky enough, were able to get out, they were not allowed to take anything with them. No money, no jewelry, just a small suitcase with some of their clothes. And you know, it is difficult to go in a new land, to start a new job with a family, if you have no resources. So this, of course, obviously must have helped my father to carry on a business. And so he went immediately, that was still possible, but when we wanted to follow the Germans and the other countries at close borders. And that was the whole tragedy of the Holocaust, that by 1938-39, Jewish people from those occupied countries like Austria, later Czechoslovakia, they're not able to get out of the country anymore. And then Hitler realized that nobody wants Jews, so if I'm going to kill them, nobody was going to lift a finger or stop it or even feel sorry. And this is really what happened.
Did your father try to come to the United States or to England?
No, I don't think so. So his sister, her husband was working for a big publisher, Phaidon Press, and they were able to get out. So my father had family in England, but as he had connection in the Netherlands, I think and unfortunately many people thought, because in the First World War, Holland was bypassed, and people assumed that will happen again. So Holland was considered a safe country in the beginning, but it wasn't, of course.
Now you indicate that before you left, it was obvious that you were going to be leaving and you couldn't take money with you. It was very difficult to take possessions, but your parents went shopping and bought a lot of things. And in your book, which I recommend to everybody, Amazon.com or whatever, this is a fantastic book, Eva's story. You indicate that your mother took you shopping and she bought you clothing that you thought would be very fashionable in Holland, but you didn't think it was particularly pretty, nor did you want to wear it. So could you tell us that story?
Yeah. Well, my mother, she was quite fashionable, but as a child I didn't want to draw attention to myself, and she bought an orange coat with a Scottish hat. And I just hated it the minute she came home with it, and I said, I'm not going to wear it. And I was born in May, at Taurus, so a very stubborn child, and I really never wore the coat till my mother had it dyed navy blue.
Good for you. You were strong from the very beginning.
Yeah, I was.
So in 1938, so you were born in 1938, June, you went from Austria to Breda, Holland. So you went from living quite well in Vienna to living in Vienna but being persecuted as a Jew, and now you were taking another step, going to a foreign country, having to give up your citizenship to a foreign country. Number one, how did you feel about that? And could you describe your life, what it was like living in Holland before the war?
Well, what was the most difficult thing for children was that they didn't know the language of the country where they were going to live. And you know, that is very, very difficult. You can't make friends, you can't make yourself understood. And so we became actually very shy and withdrawn, especially having experienced anti-Semitism already. So my whole way of thinking, I became actually withdrawn, and which I wasn't before. So my whole personality changed within a few months.
At that time, during that period of time, you got to know Anne Frank, and if you don't mind, I'll read something from your book that I found very, very interesting. You know, given the fact that Eva Schloss is, in a sense, the voice of Anne Frank, what were they like? How did they get along with each other? Were they similar or different? So this is directly from your book, so I assume it's almost a quote. Okay. So one day she was already had opinions about what she wore. You know that already. She didn't like orange and wearing this Scotch hat. So once when Mutti, which is what she calls her mother, had taken me to the local dressmaker to have a coat altered, we were sitting, waiting our turn, and hear the dressmaker talking to her customer inside the fitting room. The customer was very determined to have things just right. It would look better with a larger shoulder patch, we could hear her saying in an authoritarian tone of voice. And the hemline should be just a little bit higher, don't you think? When the dressmaker agreeing with her, I sat there wishing I was allowed to choose exactly what I wanted to wear. I was flabbergasted when the curtains were drawn back and there was Anne, all alone, making decisions about her own dress. It was peach-colored with a green trim. She smiled at me and she said, "Do you like it? Twirling around?" "Oh, yes," I said breathlessly, in great envy. I was not up to that standard.
That's true. That's true. She was much that well. You know, she came already when she was 4 years old to Holland, spoke Dutch already perfectly well, and she really had become a Dutch little girl and was quite sure of herself.
So what type of relationship did you have with her during that period?
Well, when we met, we were both 11, and that is what people did at the time after school. We went out in the street on this big square, and we played games like skipping, hopscotch, marbles was very, very popular with all of us, and bicycle. Everybody had a bicycle, of course, in Amsterdam. And there were boys and girls, and Anna was very, very, like you see with the dress she wanted to put, very smart and to attract boys. And when I told her I had an older brother, her eyes became very big, and she said, "When can I come and meet him?" But Hans was not interested in a little girl the age of his sister. You know, he was looking more his own age.
Well, we'll speak a lot more about Heinz, who was a remarkable individual, your brother, a little bit older than you. So if we think about this as a timeline, on May 10th, 1940, Germany invaded Holland. And from that time on, you were a Jew in Holland, living freely, but it was obvious already.
With restrictions, many, many restrictions.
Yeah, so that's what I'm interested in. What were the restrictions that started coming about even before the Nazis invaded Holland?
Oh, before the Nazis invaded, we were free, we could do everything. But as soon as they came in, they started, you know, we were very much afraid that perhaps the population would go against us, like in Austria, but that was not the case. On the contrary, the Dutch all said, don't worry, we are going to protect you, you belong to us, and so on. But they didn't count on the viciousness of the Nazis. Yeah. And so the first year, it became difficult, but not less. Oh, can't hear me. Is your microphone on? Okay. Where were we?
We're talking about the increasing restrictions.
It was a nuisance. We were not allowed to go on the public transport, but we all had bicycles. We had to hand in our radios. We were not allowed to go early out in the morning shopping or 8 o'clock, so there was a curfew for Jewish people. Then we had to wear the yellow star, which became already a little bit more dangerous. But so I hope this is better. I said I can hear myself better now. Can you hear better now? Yeah, it was on the wrong side. Okay, so we were not allowed to go to theater or to concerts. What for us children was, now I think it was really very childish, but at the time the first Disney films, Chabad and the Seven Dwarfs came out, and all the non-Jewish children, of course, went to see that, and that was the talk of the town. And Jewish children were not allowed, begging, Jewish children were not allowed to go to see this. That's not me doing. Technician, perhaps, opening this, I don't know. It makes a bang, huh, from time to time.
Maybe something in between.
Perhaps it's better.
Yeah.
So everybody, all the children saw Snowman and the Seven Dwarfs, and we Jewish children didn't see it. And you know, for us children, when we were 11, 12 years old, that was very, very bad. And but slowly the measures became more dangerous. For instance, we had to go to Jewish school, leave our own schools. And what happened there, the Germans wanted really to, especially wanted all the young people, and so they went there with trucks and told, for instance, went into a classroom, told the children to go down on the truck, and in the evening the parents waited for the children to come home, and they never turned up. Can you imagine? They went to the police, first the Dutch police, then the Nazi police, the Gestapo, and never got any information. Those children were never ever seen again. Only after the war, they were here, they were murdered in Mauthausen, which was a horrific Austrian death camp.
In July 2nd, 1942, Heinz was instructed to be deported. So that was a line in the sand. It was obvious that something needed to be done, and your family went into hiding. You were separated from your father and your brother. That lasted for a considerable period of time. Could you give us some feeling for what it was like when you went into hiding?
Well, Heinz and many, about 10,000 young people, including Anne Frank's sister Margot, and that is when the Frank family went to hiding, and exactly the same time as we did. We didn't tell each other because, you know, as I said, the Dutch were very good, but nevertheless, there was a big Nazi party there as well. And you didn't always know who you could trust. So you just did the 6 for your own and never even talked about it. So my father called us together and he said, I found wonderful Dutch people who are going to help us to keep safe. They offer us their homes. We're going to stay with them. But I couldn't find one family who wanted to take in 4 people. So he told me, I will go with my mother and Heinz will go with him. And I started to cry. I was very, very attached to my brother and my father. And so my father explained, if we're in 2 different places, the chance that 2 of us will survive is bigger. And this was the first time he had mentioned survive, and I was 13, and I realized it might be a matter of life and death, which it was, of course. And this was very, very frightening for a 13-year-old. And from then on, you know, my attitude to the whole period changed dramatically.
On May 1944, your 15th birthday, a birthday party in the morning, you were presumably within the limitations. God knows what's going to happen now.
Okay, yes, I think that will work.
Okay, so
Maybe I can't look at you now when I speak.
it's okay. So at your birthday party, you were still in hiding, and all of a sudden, the doorbell rang. I'll read you directly from the book. A sudden ring of the doorbell startled us. We were not expecting anyone. Who was calling at that time of the morning? Mr. Rietsma got up from the table and went downstairs to open the door. To our sickening horror, we heard the Gestapo storming in. What was your feeling at that moment?
At that moment we were in shock and incomprehensible. How could this happen? Well, how did they know where we were? And it turned out that we were betrayed by a Dutch nurse who was a double agent. It's a bit a complicated story, but this is what happened. My father and brother had to change. We were about in 7 different hiding places in those 2 years, and my father and brother as well. And they had just changed and to a house where this Dutch nurse took them, and she was actually a Nazi. And they were arrested, and we had visited them that day, and they had followed us, so very refined, and they knew where we were, and so they took us away.
So you were arrested, all 4 of you?
And in shock.
And in shock, total shock. And within, I think, a few days, you found yourself having, again, started from Vienna. Now you were arrested by the Gestapo in Holland, put on a cattle car with, as we heard, tremendous number of people, I mean, unbearable, unimaginable conditions, finding yourself, still the 4 of you, in Auschwitz, finally getting off the train, maybe feeling some degree of relief, and then being on a truck with the 4 of you going to Auschwitz. And I'll read something from your book that I thought was the most poignant, difficult to read. I'm almost sorry to have to ask you to relive this. But, so this is the moment when they arrive in Auschwitz, and this is what we hear from Eva. She was instructed by her father and mother to wear a heavy overcoat and a hat for reasons we don't need to go into right now, but may have saved her life. And this is what she says. Very reluctantly, I put the coat on. I was sure I looked silly in the hat. It was a brown felt and far too grown up for me. I would never wear such a hat by choice. You look a smart young lady now, Pappy said, trying to encourage me. Heinz gave me a weak smile. He looked petrified. His face was white with fear as he jumped down from the truck, but he turned to help me. As I sprang into his arms, I found mine around his neck. Suddenly we were squeezing and hugging each other as if we'd never see each other again. It took about an hour of unloading and organization before the women were ordered to walk towards the front of the platform while the men were separated and marched towards the back. Pappy grabbed hold of my hands, looked me deeply in the eye, and said, "God will protect you, Eva." Muti clasped Heinz close to her, running her fingers through his hair and kissing his face. Then my parents embraced for the last time before being forced to turn and walk away from each other.
Yes, you know, many people saw and many people never did see their family again. This was, of course, a most horrendous moment.
So from there, you went to Birkenau, the women, I guess, in Birkenau, the men in Auschwitz, and initially you were put into quarantine for a few weeks. Could you just say again, this descent, almost a descent into hell, what was it like being there? Do you have any recollections of, in a sense, how far you'd fallen?
Yes, well, all humanity was taken away from us. So first was the selection. So we women stood, this Dr. Mengele, the camp doctor, a professional medical man, was there not to help people, but to decide who was going to die and who was going to live. And he did this day in, day out. He went to the new transport, and we had to stand in rows of 5. He looked you over just for a fraction of a second, and then pointed right or left, life or death. And he did this nearly every day when a transport came, that was what he did. And so we lost half of our Dutch transport, and luckily my mother and me got through, me actually through the help of this hat and coat, because when Mengele looked at me, he didn't realize how young I was. Many 15 and even 17-year-old girls went the wrong side. Then we entered into a huge barrack, and the next command was undress completely naked. And the Nazis were walking around poking fun at us, how embarrassed we were. The next thing was, we all were tattooed on our arm, and they told us while they were doing it, forget you're a human being, if ever we want you, we just call you out by your number, and you're really like cattle. And then all our hair was shaved. Eventually we were walking outside, still naked, and there were huge heaps of clothes, mountains of clothes, all confiscated from transports, and we were sold one garment. That was all we had. And the next heap was shoes, and we were sold 2 shoes, which of course was never a pair, never anything that fitted. And then we were herded really like a group of sheep or cows into a big barrack, 3 bunks high, wood, nothing in it, and like cages. And that is, they told us, this is where you're going to live as long as you live here. And very soon we were invested with lice and bed bugs. Washing was something which practically never happened. We were really filthy. With dirty nails, we scratched our bodies, we had oils on our bodies, we became infected. In the morning, we got a little mug of liquid, in the evening a big chunk of bread. And that was it, nothing the whole day. And many people decided, well, they want to keep part of the bread for next day, so that they had something. But you know, we had nowhere to keep anything. So the only place was to sleep on it, to put it under your head. But very often, not perhaps in the first few weeks, but later on, when it slipped away from your head, or your head slipped from the bread, the person who slept next to you ate it up. So you had nothing for the next day. So, and that was a tragedy as well, you know, that people really were only for themselves. They didn't harm each other, but they didn't really have compassion to help other people. I think that was part of the degradation of us human beings. We really had to use all our strength and will to keep alive.
Following that horrible experience, you were selected to be in a unit that I guess was called Canada.
It's a nickname.
Nickname
Canada,
Canada.
sort of better life and freedom. It was not better and it was not freedom, but at least the work was not so hard.
So tell us what that work was. I thought it was very, very interesting.
Yeah, well, every transport which came, everything what you had with you, of course your clothes anyway they took away, but if you had your suitcase or a backpack or whatever you had, a bundle, you had to leave everything. And that was all collected in a huge, huge area of the camp, nicknamed Canada. And I was picked out, and it was my first job really there, with many, many thousands of other people to sort it all out. And one of my jobs was to open the hems of garments, because people had brought all kinds of valuables with them, thinking that perhaps they can bribe a guard or something. So I found jewelry, I found money, as well many pictures of children, you know, what they brought in the camp, and everything we had to hand over. And that was actually a great tragedy, because that was when the Hungarian, 1944, June 1944, when the Hungarian Jews were picked up. And so they needed more people to work in this Canada. And so I saw every day thousands of young women coming, and very often there was no selections with those people. And the Mark walked straight into the gas chambers.
A question that people naturally ask, an important question, is what did the civilization, the civilian population think about what was going on in Auschwitz-Birkenau? And you have a little piece in your book where you say, walking from the camp to Canada, let me just read. We left the camp preceded by a little band playing marching music. We were all dressed alike, but presentably, so that the farmers in the fields would not think we were treated badly. However, they must have been aware of the armed guards and dogs that accompanied us, seen our shaved heads and the gaunt, strained faces of the older inmates. Too many of us appeared half-starved for them not to be aware that something horrible was happening to us. But, as most people do, when confronted by things they don't want to know about, they turn the other way. What were your thoughts as you saw the Polish people working in the fields as you were being marched as a prisoner in a concentration camp?
Well, people looked at them begging, you know, for perhaps they could throw a piece of bread or even an onion or whatever they just have, because we were really starving. But never ever anybody showed compassion.
One of the miracles, so to speak, in your experience there was in June 1944, when during that brief lunch break you had, you saw your father, Pappy. Could you describe what that was like?
Normally, of course, when you worked outside, you had no lunch break. You had no lunch anyway. So you worked really from morning till late at night. But at Canada, you could, there was a lunch break, and we didn't get food, but we found lots of food, of course, as well, in the middle of the luggage. And you were able to sit down on the ground and eat it. And I did that. And across the electrified barbed wire fence, I saw a man walking in a striped uniform, you might have seen that, and a hat. And so I couldn't see his face, but I realized I know this man. And he looked a little bit at me, and I realized it was my father. And you know, this is really, that didn't happen to anybody. that he was just working as well across the fence, because Auschwitz, the men camp, was actually quite far away from where the women were. And he asked me, and there was a guard marching on that gate, but he asked me, when the guard was just a little bit away, he said, can you find cigarettes and throw it over to me? And I was surprised because I said, we don't smoke. And he said, but it's a very valuable exchange things. You can get all kinds of things for cigarettes. And I did find, of course, cigarettes as well. And for 3 days I saw him and I was able to throw it over. But then I didn't see him anymore.
Now, at one point, you described in October 1944, you and your mother, Muti, were actually separated by Dr. Mengele. You were sent on one side, and she was sent somewhere else, and you assumed that she was going to the gas chamber.
Yeah. We came out of a shower. Once a week we were deloused, and so we could wash then. And naked we came out again, and we had to walk in front of this Dr. Mengele, and he looked you over, and when he decided you had become too thin or too pale perhaps, I don't know, you were taken away, and so he picked 40 women out of our Dutch transport, and one of them was my mother, and those women marched naked out of the barrack to another barrack, to wait to be taken to the gas chambers. We knew that.
So, can only barely imagine the feeling.
That was terrible. And when he told her this side, I just ran across, I said to go goodbye to her, and one of the Nazis with a big stick beat me over the back and separated us. So not even a farewell I could say, to thinking I would lose my mother at that time.
So here Eva thought really she was alone in the world, even worse than things could have been before even imagined. Thought that she lost her mother. But from what I understand, you developed very severe frostbite. You could barely walk. Your toes were frostbitten. You were reluctant to go to the hospital because many people never got out. But you went to the hospital and you had a very big surprise there. Could you describe what happened?
Well, it was actually a bit more complicated because by that time it was midwinter, and the Germans knew that the Russians were approaching, and they started to evacuate the camps. It took every day thousands of people out from Auschwitz-Birkenau and marched them into Germany and Austria. And so many guards had disappeared as well. And there were A, B, C, D camps, many different camps. It was all separated by electrified barbed wire. But when so many guards had gone, the gates were open and you could go from one place to the other. And then some Dutch people from our transport came one day from my part, from where they were, to my part, and they told me they'd seen my mother alive. And I couldn't believe it. I thought they just wanted to give me courage, but it was true. And they told me where she was, in which part, and so I went there, and she was there indeed still alive.
Do you remember what she said to you when she saw you, or what you said to her?
Well, we of course, we were, I had a big winter coat at that time, nothing underneath, and so I looked as if I was still quite strong, but my mother took me, of course, and opened the winter coat and saw more skeleton there. So both quite shocked about the condition we were both in.
So as you indicated, at this point, the Russians were moving very quickly towards the west, the Germans were retreating, and for a period of time, the camp was not occupied by German guards. You discovered...
Not so much. There were still some, but it was not so strict discipline. Sometimes we didn't go out to work, and we were much more free, but still we didn't get any food, and many people died.
Now you describe a time, maybe a little bit after that, when you were able to move freely throughout the camp, looking for food, You came to the cabin where the German officers stayed, found some food. But there's one point in the book that I thought was really, to me, very, very inspiring. When you were in that cabin where the German officers were, and I'll read from your book, a woman forced open the door and she yelled, "There's a bear at the gate, a bear at the gate, come quickly." Cautiously, we went outside towards the open gate, and there at the entrance was the bear. A huge being covered from head to foot in bearskin and with a look of utter amazement on his face. We stood and stared at each other, and then carefully I edged towards him with joy on my face. Our liberator stood at the entrance to the camp, alone and strong. With outstretched arms, I ran to him, hugging against him. The Russians had come.
That was an amazing moment. But of course, he was just a scout and he had to go again, and he left us again. But then after about 10 days, the proper army came. And this was 27th of January, which is now considered Holocaust Memorial Day, the liberation of Auschwitz. And very often people ask me, well, so you were free, did you sing, did you dance, were you happy? Well, we were glad in one way, but we didn't know. But now, and many people still died. So it was not really yet the end of our suffering.
So you were in Birkenau, and then you were moved to Auschwitz. I guess a few days later, that's where the men
camp.
Yeah.
Well, we just went, you know, we were free, we could go anywhere. But I decided I would go and try to find my father and my brother.
So would you describe then what it was like looking for your father and Heinz and then meeting Otto?
Well, I went there through the snow. It was quite, you know, there was no path. I just had to try to find it. It was very, very difficult. There was fierce fight and the bullets were flying over me. And, but eventually I got there. And the Russians had sort of made a little headquarters there. And I asked permission if I could look everywhere. And so I did. And there were as well about 500 men left. All the others had been taken out of the camp when the Nazis retreated. And so I looked around and met two people who I'd known from Amsterdam. And I went to one, and they looked familiar, but not, I was really not quite sure, because he looked very, very thin and quite ashen. And I looked at him and I said, "Are you not Otto Frank?" and his father. He said, "Yes, yes." "And you are Eva Geiri and his friend." And yes, so we had recognized. We didn't know about the Frank family, that they'd been in hiding, that they'd been betrayed, that they'd sent to Auschwitz. But the first question, of course, he asked me, "Have you seen my daughters or my wife?" And I hadn't seen them, because Auschwitz-Birkenau was huge. But he had seen my father and brother, and he said, "But they've just gone with the Nazis." So at that time, I realized they probably will be alive, and the war would soon be finished, and we'll be reunited again. But the war was not soon finished. It was January. It didn't finish till May, and in this period, still many, 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 many people perished. Especially on those death marches, because people were taken out of the camp, marched into Austria and Germany. Many millions of them, millions actually, still died.
You arrived back in Holland in June of 1945. Before we get there, could you describe briefly what it was like being with the Russians and moving east to Odessa, and what were your feelings about the Russians once they freed you?
Yeah, well, this is a favorite topic of mine, because the Russians have a very bad reputation, unfortunately, but the people really were wonderful. The soldiers really looked after us, because the war was not finished. and we couldn't go back to the west yet. So they took us into safety, and we traveled eastward. And we traveled for 4 months with them, and we went through Russia and Romania and Poland, and we saw unbelievable devastation. The Germans had burned down every town, every village, every field. There was nothing going, and the Russians were pursuing the Nazis. And but nevertheless, it took time to keep us safe, so we traveled eastward, again in the same kind of trains, but they were kept open. There was a stove in the middle. Every day they gave us food, and sometimes we stopped and we could go into a little town to try to, we tried to buy things and exchange things and swap things and beg things. It was really quite an amazing group of people. And sometimes the locals came out to find out if we had seen perhaps their family. There were quite a lot of Jewish soldiers who were fighting in the Russian army, and they too showed us pictures of their family if we had perhaps seen them. And you know, it was actually still a very, very sad situation to travel along. But eventually we were put up in Odessa, and there we waited for the end of the war. And when that came, then it was, of course, we really realized we had survived. And there was a Russian brought to that big house where we were staying, a ballet and opera company from the town. And we sat on the floor and listened to this beautiful music and dancing. And, you know, we started to feel slowly a bit like human beings again.
When you arrived back in Holland in June 13th, you still were hoping that Pappy and Heinz were still alive. Could you describe what happened then and when you found out that they did not survive?
Well, we put upwards in the paper. We went every day to the train station to see who had come back from Germany or from Poland. And eventually we got a letter from the Red Cross, quite cool, you know, not with feeling, telling my mother that your husband and your son, with a name, died in Mauthausen, this terrible Austrian death camp, several days before the American army came to liberate that camp. That was, of course, for us the last storm. Because, like I told you before, I had survived because I hoped life would go back eventually again to how it used to be. But when I realized that it will never ever happen again, I became very, very depressed. More depressed than I was in the camp. And Otto Frank came as well to tell us a terrible tragedy, that his wife and both his daughters had died.
So Otto Frank was without family. You and your mother survived. Your mother and Otto Frank initially became good friends and then became husband and wife. Any reflections on that? And when did you first become aware of Anne Frank's diary?
Well, Otto came with a diary after it had been given me by me Keys, and he was so moved that he had that, and he said, "Can I read you something out of it?" And he opened it really very, very carefully, and he started to read a couple of sentences, but he always burst into tears. And it took him 3 weeks to read it, and it was so emotional to him. And he always used to say, "I feel as if my little girl is still with me." But he said as well, he knew he was writing a diary, but of course he had never read it. But he said, "I didn't really know my own child." He was deeply, deeply astonished and moved, and I suppose glad as well about the wisdom she showed already in her early age, about different aspects, about women's rights, about equality, about human nature, about religion. She had an opinion already about all kinds of things. And when the book came out in Dutch in 1947, of course he gave us a copy and I read it. But I must admit, I was so occupied with my own suffering still that I said, well, so what? I went through the same thing, and I wasn't impressed at that time. But my mother, of course, realized more the value of the book, and she encouraged Otto to publish it, of course, as well. But it wasn't a success at that time in Holland, because people really wanted to move on. And only when it was published in America in 1952, did it become a big success.
So you lived through this depression, having survived, but having lost what was most valuable to you, your family. You still have your mother, and now Otto. How did you first meet Eva Schloss, your husband, and give us a sense of how you came out of that deep abyss?
Yeah, well, when I finished school, I didn't know what to do with my life, and I didn't really particularly care. I was still in a really bad depression. And Otto Frank had come very often to our house and talked to me, and he said, you know, if you hate people, the people you hate, they don't suffer, but you become a very miserable, sad person. And that was true. And he who had lost everything didn't hate anybody. And that really was for me actually quite a miracle. How can a man who lost his children and his wife not hate everybody? But he said, I don't. And so he was a great help to me. And when I didn't know what to do, what profession to go in, he and my mother decided I should become a photographer. And I didn't really care. And Otto knew somebody in London who had a photographic studio. And he got me a place there, so I went for London for a year to become an apprentice. And I lived in a little boarding house where a young man from Israel had come to study economics. And we didn't really know each other. You know, we went for walks, both of us hadn't give any money. And I told him I was Dutch, which I wasn't, because I was stateless still, because we lost our nationalities. And he told me he was an Israeli, which he wasn't. He was a German refugee. But nevertheless, we went, we became very friendly. And after 6 months, he said to me, Eva, I fall in love with you, will you marry me? And we can start a new life and go to Israel when I finish my studies. And I said to him, no, thank you. And he was taken aback. He said, why not? So I said, well, I have a widowed mother at home, and when my year is finished, I will go back to her. We were very, very, very close, as you can imagine. And then Otto Frank, who kept an eye on me, came over to London, and I told him what had happened, and he was a little bit shy, and then he said to me, you know, your mother and me have fallen in love as well, and once you get settled, we like to get married. So I went back to this young man, and I said, now you can marry me now. He was, of course, very pleased. And so we went the next year to Amsterdam because we didn't know anybody in London, and got married. And we were married for 62 years. Unfortunately, I lost him a year and a half ago. He had Alzheimer's, and he was really very, very poor. And I talk in schools around in London very often when I tell the children I was married 62 years with my husband. They always ask me, with how many husbands? Not just one. And I just can't believe that. We got 3 daughters, and later on 5 grandchildren. They all live in London. And that is, of course, where it was very, very important to me, because I always wanted to have a big family. But 3 is not so big, especially when I look at the Chabad. But I had suffered mentally and physically, and it was just, I had really problem. I had all kind of illnesses, and I couldn't really get more children. But I'm very happy with my 3 daughters anyway.
So your life changed, seems to me, dramatically in 1985. You were with 2 friends, Anita and Barry, good friends, and something happened in that conversation that made you realize that while you had had this experience but had not been public about it, what was it that made you want to write a book and change your life to become the person that you are now, a spokesperson for maybe one of the most important stories that anybody could ever tell?
Well, you know, when I came back from Auschwitz, everybody said, never again Auschwitz, they've learned our lesson. And people really tried to, you know, for a few years there was really more peaceful, people helped each other, and it looked as if the society was going to change for the better. But we see it hasn't. There was the first Cambodia disaster, and then the Korean War, and the Vietnamese War, and in Europe and in Cambodia and everywhere. And now again in the Middle East, terrible, terrible things are happening. 65 million refugees are looking for a home. And again, the world doesn't want them. So, but this, of course, I didn't know at the time. But I realized, I think when I had a shock when the Vietnamese people tried to escape on little boats on the ocean, and big ships passed, and we're not allowed to pick them up, and the people drowned. And I realized, really, we haven't learned anything. So I started to be more involved in what was going on around me, but was much too shy to speak about it. And then in 1986, an Otto Frank exhibition, because the house in Amsterdam became a museum, and the historians there decided not everybody can come to Amsterdam to learn the history about Anne, and so they made a traveling exhibition. And that came for the first time to London, and of course my mother and me were invited. Otto had died already. He was 17 years older than my mother. And so we sat on a platform, and everybody speak well, and I went just as a guest. And then the organizer said, and now Eva, we want to say something to you. Well, I'd never spoken, I was very shy, I never wanted to open my mouth in front of 2 or 3 people. And there I stood, not quite as big a crowd as this, but still 200 people, and I just wanted to hide under the table. But eventually I started to speak, and I don't know what I said, but whatever, it changed my life, because I told them a little bit about what has happened. And then the exhibition traveled all over England. They always asked me to open it. My husband wrote a speech for me because I couldn't speak freely. I always had to take a tranquilizer. I didn't do it today. And this is really, and then people said to me, you know, you have such an interesting story as well, you should write it. And this is how I came to write my first book, Eva Story.
Well, your energy is unbelievable. Just listening to the trip that you're involved in right now, which sounds like it's...
A 6 weeks tour from west to east and from north to south, yeah, and always to a big crowd. I think this is the biggest crowd, but still... 800 to 1,000 people usually come to hear the story.
Well, it's starting to come to the end. I can't bear to give this up, and you said we could probably talk for 2-3 hours, but I don't
easily
think
we could. But we would be shown out here, I think.
So, from what I understand, people in the audience have gotten index cards, and if you have questions for Eva Schloss, why don't you give it to the people walking in the aisles, and we'll try to choose just a few. But until we do that, let me ask you the first question. If I were sitting in the audience, almost the obvious question. So what is your message? You know, we talked about people trying to live through you, the experience, but what is it that you want this audience to have learned from spending this evening with you?
Well, you know, we are very, very lucky people. We live in this beautiful country in Western Europe. We live on a wonderful planet, and nevertheless, we are not happy. We have great prejudice against people who are different from us. The black people, the brown people, the Christians, the Jews, the Muslims, all those people are wonderful people, and but we prejudice against certain people who are not the same as we are. And this can cause really, really a lot of harm, and as well it causes wars and discrimination, and this is one of the things we have to really grow out of it, to discriminate against people who are different from us. My husband always used to say, we are just one race, and that is the human race.
To this question, but if you had to define yourself as being optimistic or pessimistic, how would you describe yourself at this moment?
Well, I worry, I must say I do worry, but nevertheless I'm optimistic. I've got myself 5 grandchildren, and they all realize that the world has to be changed. They all do charitable work. The boys have all been to Africa to help out there, and I've heard many, many people do this around the whole world. And I think the young people are really willing to make sacrifices to create a safer and better world.
Okay, so these are the questions from the audience. We'll just be able to do as many as we can. Do you believe in God? If so, how do you keep up faith after all you've gone through?
After?
How do you keep up your faith? If you believe in God, how do you keep up your faith after what you've gone through?
Well, that is it's a question I get is usually asked, and I must admit, when I came out of the camp, I was an atheist, and as well I didn't believe in humanity. And this is why I had a really, really very hard time, because I was full of hatred, and if you don't believe in anything, you're a really very sad person. And but I wasn't happy who I was, and I wasn't happy how I couldn't relate to people or to my religion. I was always a very, very proud Jew. I would never give up my Judaism. But I started to doubt the existence of God, because in the camp the only thing what we could do, and there were actually many, of course, religious people who prayed all the time, and so did we. We prayed to God to stop those atrocities, and God didn't. And so when I came out, and especially when I realized how many millions of innocent children had died, and many people from my own family, I just couldn't comprehend that if there is a God, that he could tolerate that. And but you know, without belief, life is really very, very hard. And the birth of my first daughter made this big change in me, because I couldn't really conceive, and I was desperate, and had medical treatment, and eventually gave birth to a beautiful child. And that really changed my whole belief again. And as well, I met some wonderful people, and I realized, you know, life has a lot to offer. And of course, you know, I wouldn't say now I believe 100%, but I think that is a mystery of life. We will never yet know. The same, we will not know what will happen after death. And I've accepted that. One day I'm full of belief. I go to synagogue. I love being in the tranquility of a service and praying. and then I get home and I look at television and see atrocities happening, and I start again to doubt. So, but you know, I'm happy with how I believe now. This is what we don't know. I think nobody knows. You can believe or you cannot believe, but the mystery of our lives is always there with us.
Have you forgiven the Nazis? If so, how did you do it?
I have forgiven the German people as a whole, but not the individual Nazis who, the leaders who planned these terrible atrocities, who sat together. There's a one-night conference, a place near Berlin. They came together, had a big meal and got all drunk and decided how to get rid of all the Jews in a cheap and quick way through gassing. Those people, those were really, really evil people. And for those, of course, I have no forgiveness. But the German people by itself, I think, you know, every country has made mistakes, every country has done terrible things to other people, but we have to accept that as in the past, and I have great respect for the Germans now and Angela Merkel, who is the only one who took in 1 million refugees. Of a guilt feeling, because they want to make good of the crimes the people used to commit.
What advice would you give, you're here at Duke, and I'm sure we have a lot of students here, at least I hope we do. What advice would you give the younger generations in order to combat anti-Semitism, intolerance, and social injustice?
Well, you know, just start with yourself, start in your own circle, start with your friends, mix with all those people. And I've been going in England to Muslim services, and you know, when you go there, you realize it's actually very, very similar to a Jewish service. The Jewish service in Hebrew, which I can't understand, the Arab have a service in Arab, which I can't understand. But you know, the men pray, the women are just there as well to support them, and it's very similar. And so go to mix with Muslim, mix with Christian, eat their food, celebrate their holidays with them, and you know, we can be best of friends with a different opinion about religion and about all kind of things in our life. And starts with your small circle and the larger circle, till eventually everybody will do that.
What do you think about the recent laws in Poland that, well, you could say deny their role in the Holocaust?
Well, there have been Holocaust deniers since we know what has really happened. And I don't take that too seriously. You know, there was, you've seen probably this film, The Denier. We had in England this David, forgotten his name, who denied the Holocaust. And actually in Austria and Germany it is an offense. David Irwin, he spent in Austria, he was in prison because he denied the Holocaust. And the Polish people look actually after the camps. There are some individuals who obviously become anti-Semitic again. And you know, anti-Semitism has always been since history of man, and it will always be, but as long as they're not attacking people, but just talking badly about it, that is just in the language, it's an expression, we can put up with that. We just have to accept it. We can, of course, try to talk to those people, but, you know, there will always be people who will make problems for other people. And we should not get too nervous or too upset about all this.
When you were in the camp, were there any acts of kindness that were particularly meaningful to you, that gave you more faith and strength?
Unfortunately not, but I mentioned before, you know, people really tried. It was so difficult to stay alive that people really concentrate on just this. There was very little help to others. They didn't harm others, but they didn't help others either. And that was, I think, part of the plan of putting people in camps like that, to dehumanize them so that they wouldn't form a family or a group of people.
I'm kind of paraphrasing this, but an individual from a Jewish family whose father uses the Holocaust to indicate that there must not be a God because God would not allow this to happen. What do you think about that argument that since the Holocaust did happen, there must not be a God?
Well, I have arguments very often with Chabad rabbis even, and you know, I question, you know, how could it have happened? And they say, you can't question God's ways. Why? And my idea, I mean, I've been thinking very much about it. I thought, you know, in Germany and Austria, as I told you, people have been assimilating. We don't keep anymore to a lot of the laws which we should keep. So I thought perhaps that is a punishment of God. But the Chabad rabbi said, no, you mustn't ever say anything like that. And but you know, I'm looking as well for an answer, and I don't think we'll ever get an answer. And so I'm afraid I can't help you with this, but you have to make your own mind up what you believe. And if you can believe, it is you have a much more happy and peaceful life. But it depends on your own belief.
As you've already indicated, there have been many atrocities. The Holocaust is not unique in that respect. But in your mind, in your meaning, what is the significance of the Holocaust that separates it from other atrocities?
Well, I think because it was planned by very intelligent, cultured people. In Rwanda, for instance, those were tribal disputes and people started to kill each other. But it was not planned, it wasn't, you know, the Holocaust was how it was done, but is and was unique, and never anything like that will happen again. Planning in advance how to get rid of a whole group of people. That is the uniqueness of the Holocaust, I think.
When you were in the camp as a child, did you make any friends that you continued to know or knew for a long time after you survived?
Well, there was one girl, similar age of me, who was with us on the transport, and I kept a friendship up with her for many years. But and then there was another family, two sisters who we were friendly with till they died. So, but only with individuals, not with many people.
Sometimes when people survive a horrible experience where many other people don't, they feel guilty about being a survivor. Did you have to deal with that issue of survivor's guilt?
No, I must say I'm actually very happy I survived. But this survivor guilt is happening more when parents survive their children. My mother often said, why did I survive and not my son? So this is understandable, of course, and that is not the natural way. Parents shouldn't survive their children.
You mentioned your brother, your mother's son, Heinz, and you spoke so glowingly of him, and we talked about the passage of life beyond one's own life. Could you just give us some reflections about Heinz and his thoughts about survival and passing on whatever he had to others?
Yeah. Heinz, my older brother, was a a wonderful artist, a wonderful musician actually. He could play already when he was 4 years old, he could already play piano. And when in Amsterdam, the furnished apartment had a piano, he composed. And he had the perfect ear, he could play any instrument, but of course in hiding he couldn't make any music, he had to be completely silent. And so he taught himself 6 languages, and he started to paint, and he created some amazing paintings. And after Otto Frank got the diary, the last conversation I had with Heinz was in the cattle truck, when he told me that he had hid the painting before they escaped from this house where the woman was blackmailing them under the floorboards with a note on it that belongs to Heinz and Eva Geiri, and after the war I'm going to pick it up again. And after Otto got the diary, I said to my mother, we have to go and get his paintings as well, which we did, and we found really amazing paintings. And you know, Anna says in her diary, one of the things, when she dies, she would like to become immortal, meaning that she would like to live on. Well, she does. Wherever in the world I go and I mention her name, people know who she is. So she has achieved that. And very often my mother and me said, what about Heinz? He was as well such a wonderful young man, and nobody knows about him. And when he was 12 years old, being so artistic and so sensitive, he asked my father one day, he said, Papi, what will happen when I die? And my father said, well, of course your body will integrate, but you will live on in your children. And then this 12-year-old boy said, but what if I die before I've had any children? And my father saw the moment and he said, well, we are all a link in a big chain which goes from generation to generation. Nothing gets ever lost, even if you have achieved only a little bit in your life, in your short life, somebody will remember and know you won't be forgotten. So I wrote another book called The Promise from my father to Heinz that he won't be forgotten. And I tell about his life. And the paintings I donated a few years ago to the Resistance Museum in Amsterdam. And they made a big exhibition, and many, many people see what he has achieved. And so he's not forgotten. And that is really, I think, what we all want to achieve, that we haven't been in this world for nothing, that we have left something behind.
Eva, you have blessed us with your story, with your presence here tonight. Your beauty shines through you. It fills this entire room. We are so grateful for you to be here. We're so grateful for your message, and we hope it goes on for many, many, many years. But regardless, you will live forever through us telling this story to our children, to our children's children. Thank you for being with us. But before we end, let me introduce Professor Mark Brettler, an American biblical scholar and the Bernice and Morton Lerner Professor in Judaic Studies at Duke University. He's a prolific author and co-founder of the website thetough.com, which integrates critical and traditional methods of studying the Bible. In 2004, he won the National Jewish Book Award for the Jewish Study Bible. Professor Brettler.
As a member of the Duke Center for Jewish Studies, one of the sponsors of this evening, I'd like to thank you from the bottom of my heart for sharing this story with us. There are many ways to remember. I've seen the eyeglasses and the shoes of those who died in Auschwitz. As recently as 1981, when I was just a little older than some of the students here, I held in my own hands bone fragments from Jews who were killed by the Einsatzgruppen in the former Soviet Union. Such tactile experiences offer one way to remember, one way to try to understand. Personal testimony is another way, and I thank you so much for telling us your story, especially in this era of alternative facts. Please join me in thanking Mrs. Schloss for sharing with us her deep hatred for all prejudice, her personal stories, and especially for reminding us that the unbelievable is often quite believable, and that we each can, through our stories and our actions,